Dr. Jack Hunter is an anthropologist exploring the borderlands of consciousness, religion, ecology, and the paranormal. And of course, Jack is an honorary research fellow with the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Centre, and a tutor at the Sophia Centre for the Study of Cosmology in Culture at the University of Wales, St Trinity St David, where you are lead tutor on the MA and Ecology and Spirituality. And you are teaching in a number of courses, actually, some of which are, you do kind of snippets of them online sometimes that anybody can join, which I highly recommend. I've done 2 of those now, and it's expanded my understanding. So welcome back, Jack. Really nice to be with you.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Thanks. And I know you're super busy, so it's great to get together again and have a good chat over things. Now, since we last spoke, I mean, you are a very prolific writer, and you're always getting new and really interesting research out there, ideas out there, collaborations with people that we've spoken to on the show, like Joshua Cutchin, and lots and lots of other people that are in this sphere. So it's always exciting to see what you coming up. And so perhaps you can let us know further on what you're going to be working on, in this year. But for this chat, wanted to have a chat about this book, Deep Weird, which, as I say, I've read several times now. It's excellent, and there are some threads through that very much link us into what we're learning about, fairy realms, other realms. And this is something that you know of too. Of course, in our first chat, you spoke about your own personal experience with seeing these small beings. And so if people want to learn more about that, they can go back and listen to that. One of the first things I wanted to chat about was the real feeling that there's a very much a trickster-like quality that runs through a lot of the experiences found within the chapters of Deep Weird. And at this time when, a lot of people are beginning to talk about this age being a sort of trickster era, I wondered what your thoughts were in what you feel is kind of seeping through in our understanding.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there is definitely, we call it this trickster element. I think maybe we should just talk about what the idea of the trickster is. First of all, it's a kind of like an archetype, really, and you find it in Jungian psychology. But he was basically saying that if we look across, different kinds of mythological traditions, you'll find this kind of recurrent theme that keeps emerging of this character who is a kind of fluid, dynamic kind of character, and difficult to pin down. He's flighty and moves around all the time. He's very quick. He's very cunning, and he takes many different kinds of different forms. Hermes, very rapid movement and these kinds of things, and also other characters like Brer Rabbit or even Bugs Bunny. Trickster characters who mess with things, mess with people's perceptions, and change things about.
And you just broke up there when you were talking about Hermes. Could you
Yeah.
repeat that, please?
Yeah, I was just saying that Hermes is kind of like a kind of a trickster god, a god that kind of moves quickly between places, passing with messages and these kind of things. So difficult to pin down, basically.
Yeah.
And there is this kind of quality in a lot of paranormal experiences that is similarly kind of difficult to pin down. It doesn't want to be, it doesn't want to be put into a box, really. It's something that's kind of all over the place. And there's a parapsychologist called George Hansen who wrote the great book, The Trickster and the Paranormal. It's published in 2001, I think. And I think, if anyone is interested in where the trickster comes into the paranormal, that's the best place to go to find out. But he identified all of these different ways in which the paranormal kind of embodies these trickster-like qualities. One of them was, in terms of sort of parapsychology and experimental research, where there's this push to empirically prove the existence of psi phenomena. But when it comes down to it, these things that are recorded in laboratories are only just, statistically significant. They are much reduced in their intensity to what we, when we have a paranormal experience in the real world, it's a very profound, powerful experience. When we try to replicate that in a lab, it doesn't work. So there's all of these ideas about how there might be something inherently in these kinds of phenomena that is evading our prying eyes, essentially, and it doesn't want us to pin it down. And if that's the case, then any attempt to prove the reality of the paranormal or any of these kind of things is going to be problematic at best, because it's actively trying to prevent that. Obviously, if we're thinking that there is something behind all of these phenomena, maybe there are many tricksters, but it implies also that there is some kind of, an intelligence that's actively trying to confound us. So, yeah.
It's very true. And, we see this kind of evasive quality coming up again and again. They seem to be around thresholds. They seem to be around the point of, shifts. And so they encourage, they seem to kind of encompass and encourage those kind of threshold areas or times. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thresholds, if we think in terms of anthropological theory, like Victor Turner, he talked about the ritual process, and you have this liminal phase in the middle. It's a sort of like a gateway period between two discrete stages. So when you're in that liminal or threshold kind of phase, all of those sort of binaries that we use to make sense of our place in the world kind of dissolve. Our social status and all of that kind of stuff evaporates. And you're in this kind of liminal place where anything is possible, and you can come out the other side, transformed as a consequence, because you break down ego dissolution and that kind of thing, and then you reaggregate on the other side again. So I do think there is something in that, when we're in a liminal or a threshold kind of environment, even physical places, like between water and land or that kind of thing, it puts us into that frame of mind of boundary dissolution.
Exactly. And it feels, the kind of dissolution of social status and all of that. And I can see that in this time period that we're going through now, that's exactly what's happening. The system, even the social status of people that have maybe been leaders, we're not really seeing them as leaders. They're not behaving like leaders. We're not seeing them as leaders anymore. Even that kind of that status is being dissolved. And
I mean, from your perspective as someone who catalogues modern fairy sightings, do you think that this liminal phase that we're in is are more people having experiences, or is it not quite like that?
I do feel that they are. I do feel that more people are having it. I think more people are open and sensitive to it. I mean, let's face it, some of the conversations I'm having with people, we couldn't have had those, even sort of 20 years ago. And if we were, it would be just, in a private room with people that were really into it. Now people are actively seeking this because they feel it within themselves. That's what it seems like to me. I mean, when I started doing this, I was taking risks, really. I knew that I was kind of taking risks with what I was doing. But actually, and there's a sense, and I know that you will understand this working in academia, but there's always a sense that you need to have permission to talk about these things. Well, that's another aspect of the trickster, that it doesn't wait for permission. It's like a force that goes through, and it needs to, it has its own flow and it goes its own way. And I think that that's kind of what we're seeing too. So, whether it's academia you're looking at, or governmental structures, or, even kind of, education for children structures, health, all of that, these kind of dissolution of these structures that we've always hung on to. There are other ways of being seeping through, whether that is sort of lots of people deciding to homeschool their children or look at alternative health, as well as everything else that's classically on offer through our health system. That there's something else coming through, and I think that again is it's it speaks to me of the kind of character of the time that we're living through. So it's no surprise that more and more people are aware of these other worlds and that they are becoming more sensitive to communing with them, because there are parts of themselves now that they're rediscovering. This is what I feel.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that, the in these liminal times when the kind of structures that we're used to dissolve, it also makes them dangerous times because, other kinds of things can emerge. It's not necessarily a good thing. And I dropped out there, I think.
Yeah.
I was saying, I
Always
think we're
about these tricksters as well.
yeah,
Always goes awry.
yeah, they will always get excited when I get most excited. The internet trickster kicks in. But yeah, I think it's also a dangerous time because yeah, in these kind of it's like an amorphous blob of a time that could go in many different directions. Like, there is real of things going in a direction that is not good, unfortunately.
Well, then it's kind of like we're back to, and I know I've kind of mentioned this to you before briefly, we're back to this idea that, if these are sort of rites of passage, it does feel flipping scary. When you are going through some kind of rite of passage, you think you're going to die. You think you're going to, in the classic rites of passage that sort of Van Gennep and Turner were talking about, then, you do face death. Often what that results in is ego death. And sometimes maybe we're going to have to like look over the precipice and face our own kind of end in order to just pull back in time. But we don't know that. And that's the whole point of a rite of passage, is that you take it to the brink. And I do wonder if, what we're seeing, and it is scary, when we look around for a whole host of reasons. But my feeling with this is that it's something like that this is part of our rite of passage as humanity.
Yeah, I mean, these things happen in peaks and troughs, and yin yang and all of that kind of stuff. To have balance as well. I do think that those kinds of processes are probably operating. Yeah. But in terms of like our kind of subject area, we're talking about this kind of openness that we've had emerge over the last 20 years. But I do also think that there's a real risk that might sort of get snuffed out under the current circumstances,
Oh,
especially in some parts of the world. In America, at least, there's going to be a bit of a backlash against any kind of well, I suppose in many ways beyond, like fundamentalist Christian kind of worldview, which is going to impede research. And, if you're researching something that is already, airy fairy like fairies, I think there is a risk that kind of thing might come under attack, which is sad. Um, and on the other side of things is the, even in the UK where we don't have that kind of situation, thankfully, but the openness that academia has been able to kind of establish like over the years is under threat from, cuts and universities closing down and all of these kinds of things. And your whole departments and stuff that have built up a safe environment to talk about these kind of things and now, isolated places, um, which is worrying. But I also see, a positive side coming out of that as well, with more independent kinds of research centers and stuff like that that are not necessarily connected to university, but are still dedicated to an academic or, a critical kind of approach.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know what's going to happen, but I do feel like that, humanities and things like that are in a bit of a dangerous place at the moment.
Yeah, well, you would know because you're at the forefront of that. I mean, you're doing really great work down at the Trinity St. David's. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of things you've got on offer there? Because I know that people will be, in fact, one of the women in my Patreon group, and of course, she's doing some fantastic research on tree encounters. So there's really exciting things going on.
Yeah, well, yeah, I teach in the Sophia Centre, which it's been around for quite a long time now, over 20 years. It used to be at Bath Spa University for a while, and it kind of Nick Campion is the kind of nucleus of the Sophia Centre, and his main kind of drive has been the study of astrology. So he's been interested in I suppose you could call them like alternative beliefs, really. Um, and over the years has built up the Sophia Center as a place where you can talk about astrology in all sorts of different ways, which is really, useful. And it also, it kind of leaks out into other areas then as well. So spirituality comes into it, and it becomes a safe place that you can talk about, different kinds of spiritual ideas and that kind of thing. So they've been teaching an MA in, they call it astrology and cultural astronomy. So it's all of the different ways that, cultures, human beings make sense of their place in the cosmos. And recently, it's come back down kind of to the Earth as well. It's all of this is a part of our cosmologies. And now teach the MA in ecology and spirituality, which is the MA that I'm the lead tutor on. Which is all about how human beings make sense of their place in the world, but also kind of emphasizing these spiritual, extraordinary kinds of dimensions as well, and seeing where they fit into the whole thing. And yeah, some of my students are doing some really exciting things, which is always really fun and interesting because you get through students these snapshots into interesting other worlds. And yeah, I think that the student you're mentioning is doing her research on experiences of communication with trees.
Yeah.
Experienced, as a personal communications. So it is a safe place to research extraordinary things, but we couch it, it is still very much academic, and we show people how to put these things which we might think of as fringe and on the edge, and show how actually they are important and have always really been talked about in scholarly ways. There is a rich kind of lineage that we're standing on, and it often gets ignored, but it is there. So yeah, that's what the Sophia Centre is all about.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And, looking through the chapters of Weird, you get a sense of that is that, a lot of the experiences that I talk to people about on this podcast have been studied, for a long time, and there are perspectives, behind them, particularly looking at the work of William James, which is and another classic, along with George P. Hansen's Trickster book, William James's Varieties of Religious Experiences, another one, a must read if people are interested in these areas. And, you get into things like synchronicities, which are always very interesting, that run through a lot of experiences. Now, think about tree encounters or fairy encounters, or even kind of interactions with poltergeists. Or if somebody has one experience, you usually find that they've had several of them at least throughout their lives. And so, they might have sometimes these encounters or experiences run in tandem with each other, or they just kind of run as a thread throughout their lives. Yeah, I was very much interested in the synchronicity chapter. Is that something that you get into with
Yeah.
the work you're doing? I don't know if you have any of your own sort of synchronicity stories that you're able to share, but I do find them fascinating. And lots of people, this is how we often bring meaning to our lives, is that we'll be going a certain direction and synchronicity will happen. And for me, it's always felt like a kind of it's like a stitch in a tapestry that pulls us back into or reminds us that we are where we're meant to be. That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the things that I've been interested in is sort of non-human communication. And it's one of the threads I think that I draw out in the introduction to Deep Weird. And this idea of different kinds of modes of communication. And I do think that synchronicities are, another kind of mode of communication from the world beyond us. And well, this is at least this is how people generally understand them. When they have a synchronistic experience, it carries a kind of a message for them. And so what I'm interested in is these other ways of that, the natural world might try to send us messages, essentially. And they're not always going to be, they're not always going to be verbal messages, we're not always going to hear a voice or anything like that. Um, they might not even be kind of sensory experiences, but the communication could come through in these kinds of synchronicities, or that when events seem to, cross each other and intersect. Um, so yeah, I am interested in them. I don't think any major synchronistic experiences. I suppose in some ways, I mean, even just finding the Bristol Spirit Lodge, for me, this place that has actually, basically the foundation of I suppose, my career in a way, um, which I found just sort of by happenstance, really, and it was only 10 minutes down the road from where I was living at the time. It's you got to wonder about, if we're thinking in terms of spiritual agencies and these kinds of things, why that was so easy in a way to kind of to find this place and to find the thing that I was actually looking for, I suppose. But yeah, I don't often have synchronicities really. Or perhaps I do and I don't sort of clock them.
On that experience with the mediumship group, you had a bodily experience. Do you want to describe that?
Yeah, it was a time when for some reason the medium couldn't turn up. And so they decided what they were going to do was a kind of, a group, an open sitting, really. And I can't remember exactly how many people were there. It was only about 4 or 5 of us. It wasn't a big group. And we did the usual kind of opening of the séance. They read an opening prayer, um, where they kind of set the intent. And usually they would set the intent for like healing, if it was meant to be a healing séance, or physical phenomena. And in this one, they just set the intent really for spirits to, if there's any spirits present, to sort of let them be known through anyone in the room, essentially. Uh, which, when you think about it, maybe is a bit risky. But anyway, um, they so all we had to do was basically, meditate and relax and let ourselves kind of, go with the flow of whatever might happen. And I thought, I've done meditation before, not in any kind of profound, never had any really sort of profound meditation experiences, but understand the kind of point of it. And so I just sort of meditated. We listened to the music. The room was bathed in red light, so it was relaxing and it was warm in there. Um, I think about the seance room as almost kind of like a womb-like space. Again, a liminal space where there are all sorts of possibilities that could happen in there. It's a liminal space. Anyway, I was meditating. I had my arms on the arms of the chair, and I felt this. um, sort of tingling in my left hand, a bit like pins and needles. And I was in a strange sort of frame of mind where I could feel this sensation in my arm, but it felt as though I was somehow behind myself a little bit. Not very far, but just sort of detached in a way, so that I observe, observing my body, feeling it from a slightly detached point of view. And obviously that was quite strange as it was, and I was on the verge of finding it too weird. And then I started to feel my hand kind of lifting up, basically, moving around, and it started to wave. And this was, for me, quite a shock, actually. Yeah, and I started to feel, yeah, my hand moving up, and I snapped myself out of it because I could feel that it was moving, but I also had this feeling that it wasn't my kind of, I wasn't doing it on purpose. Um, it was almost as if it was just doing it of its own accord. That's what it felt like. That's the feeling of it. And yeah, I snapped myself out of it, and people in the room kind of like laughed, and I was like, "Oh shit, I've had this really weird feeling," and I was a bit sort of, flustered by it. And they were all like, well, you are in a séance and you are meditating, and we have asked, spirits to come through. So, kind of what do you expect? That kind of vibe. So I thought, okay, fair enough, and I'll see if it happens again, and it did, but it didn't go any further than my hand doing this. It was kind of just, it was almost like it was waving, and I think possibly that is maybe what it was doing. Um, but for me, it was important because I didn't want to be a medium myself, um, and to dedicate myself to that calling because it didn't feel like it was my calling. But it gave me this just of enough of an insight to say that, when people say that they have the experience of going into a trance and they're not in control of their body, that actually that is entirely possible. It's entirely possible to have that experience. It doesn't mean that the experience is spirits necessarily. It could be all manner of different kinds of, things, but it opens the door, I think. Once you accept that the experience is something that can actually happen, then you have to start thinking about the all the possibilities about what the ultimate nature of that experience might be. Um, and yeah, so that's what, in many ways, it was that experience that really, and the experience I said before. Did I talk to you before about green face? Or was that in a previous?
No, I don't think so. No, no, I knew about the
Yeah.
fairies, the sort of trooping fairies. No, I don't remember them.
Okay. Well, I'll
And
tell you.
is that the one where you were with all your friends at the? No, I think that was the fairy one. No, carry on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so there was these couple of experiences with the mediums that really kind of hooked me in, and ultimately, obviously, ended up doing a PhD about it. Um, so one was the hand movement, and the other one was I think it was probably even the very first seance that I attended, where the medium was in the cabinet in the corner of the room, and it's got curtains on it, and it's dark in there, and they sit in there, but you can see them, and the rest of the seance room is kind of again like in red light. So you have, you do strange things. Your vision does strange things in those kind of situations, sensory deprivation and all that kind of stuff. And you do see sometimes little flickers of light and flashes and stuff in optics and things like that. And I was aware of that stuff at the time, so I was seeing some little flashes of light and things. Um, and I'm assuming that they were kind of hallucinations, essentially, to think that, I have lots of these kinds of experiences. Um, and then there was this one moment when I saw that this sort of green face appear over the medium's face, almost like it looked almost like a mask. It looked like a stereotypical kind of Shaolin monk, with a bald head and a Chinese kind of face. And it was green, kind of fluorescent green. And it was over the medium's face like this. And it was there for a little, for a short while. It wasn't long. And I was like, oh, in my mind, I'm seeing something. And I assumed that it was the same as, these little entoptics that I was seeing as well. That it was just because we were in strange lighting and I'm staring, in red light, and obviously green is the opposite of red and all this kind of stuff at the medium's face, and it's going to be blurry, and it's probably nothing, is what I was basically thinking. But and it just sort of slid down, and it sort of dissolved, disappeared on a sort of chest. And so I kept it to myself. I didn't say anything at the time that it was happening. I just thought it was me hallucinating again. And when we went out into the house afterwards to sort of have biscuits and stuff, and they would have a sort of a debrief really and talk about if they'd seen anything or had any strange sensations or anything like that. One of the other sitters, he said, "Did anyone else see that green face?" And I had to, I did say that I did see it, but that it didn't have the kind of quality of, when you see a physical object in front of you, it's solid. It didn't look like that. It didn't look like a solid thing even. It looked like what a hallucination kind of looks like. But somehow it was a hallucination that, other people obviously had seen as well. So that was for me a big kind of point of realizing that maybe there's more to this than any of the kind of standard, anthropological theories kind of account for. Usually they would explain mediumship in terms of psychological and social functions and that kind of thing. But that doesn't help you to understand why two people might have a hallucination at the same time of a green face.
Did it mean anything to the person who was in trance, the green face?
Not as far as I'm aware. I mean, it may well have been. She did have a spirit team. Each of the mediums had a spirit team of up to about, I think the maximum number of spirits one of the teams had was about 15 spirits.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's a possibility that it could have been part of her extended spirit team or something, but it didn't talk or anything. And often if in those seances, if a spirit is there, it will talk in some way in a funny squeaky voice or something. But this just appeared and disappeared really. In mediumship, they call it transfiguration, face transfiguration. And it's one of the kind of phenomena that they do try to develop, as physical mediums. But yeah, it was a really strange thing to see. And it made me think that there must be more going on with this.
Also, I'm thinking about the cover of Greeting the Paranormal. Isn't that a green face?
Yes, it is.
For you, that kind of brings a bit of meaning, if you like, and I wonder about the other person that saw it and whether, I don't know, what your studies, whether your studies had an impact on them, whether your research, I'm immediately thinking, hang on, that green face, that sort of reminds me.
The kind of the time loop
Yeah.
idea of the green face, because I wasn't, in really thinking of in ecological terms or about any kind of green aspect. I thought I was just thinking in terms of, well, spirits really, and how do we think about spirits and that kind of stuff. But it was only later on, and this might come back to when we were talking about at the bottom of the garden, that I sort of realized, I don't know why I didn't think about this at the time, but all of the seances that I attended were in the garden. Because the seance room was a specially built garden shed. And I, you know, when I was doing Green Paranormal, I started to think about this. And I messaged back to Christine, the circle leader, and I just said, you know, I'd never really thought about it before, but obviously the lodge is in the garden. And is there any kind of, meaning for that or anything? And she spends a lot of time and still does, gardening, tending the garden. She calls it the lodge garden. It is attached, the garden shed is in the garden. And she said that she interpreted it as a kind of almost like we were saying before, threshold. You pass through the garden as a liminal place and you go into the sacred space. And that was not her terms, the kind of paraphrasing what she said, but into this special place of the seance room. And the garden is, yeah, the kind of antechamber. And I'm using that word deliberately because when I started to think about this, is there something about gardens and paranormal experiences and that kind of thing, which there is, it seems. I found a great chapter, Gardens in the Ancient World, used to be understood as these antechambers to the nether, and they were kind of ritual spaces, uh, where you might have a shrine or something, at the bottom of the garden, and the purpose of the garden was really to, guide you to that place around the world. Gardening techniques that are kind of geared towards establishing good relationships with the spirits of place, and also all of these traditions to do with keeping bad spirits out of gardens as well. You don't want them damaging your food and things like that. So anyway, there is a whole interesting thing about gardens and the paranormal. And also, think about UFOs and aliens and things. People see aliens there, like outside the window in their gardens and that kind of thing. And fairies at the bottom of the garden, obviously, is a big motif. Um, the Cottingley fairies is kind of like an embodiment of that whole idea that there is a special place at the bottom of the garden. And just on this, I can't remember, I don't know if you saw it, but it was either last year or the year before. And I was thinking about all of this kind of stuff. I was up in the house and it was the summer and the kids were playing down at the bottom of the garden. And they came running up to the house screaming. And I was like, what's the matter? And they both said that they were on the trampoline down there, which is right down at the very bottom of the garden. And they said that they said it was a goblin, and it had a red hat on and a club with nails sticking out of it. And and it sounds crazy. And I thought this is almost too good to be true. So I'm going to capture this, and I got my laptop and I recorded them giving I'll send you the link, describing it and or what they'd seen kind of independently, separate from each other. And they both drew a little goblin with a club and stuff. And they said that they heard it laughing right underneath the trampoline, in the center of the trampoline, and it scared them, and they ran back up to the house. When I went down there to have a look, straight down there to check, I didn't see anything, obviously, but I took a picture of the trampoline. Yeah, so it's strange that there is something about that kind of place in the garden. It's often a wild bit, where you might not tend it as closely as you do parts that are closer to the house. Yeah, there are some parts of the garden that are not close to the house, so you don't tend them as kind of regularly. So they're wild. And there's an interesting idea in permaculture. They talk about zone analysis. So when you're designing your garden, you split the garden into different zones. And zone 0 is kind of you, and that'd be like you in your house. And then it goes out, further out. And the idea is that you put all your kind of high maintenance things close to your house, because you don't have to go far to keep an eye on them. And then things that you need to spend less time with are further away. So orchards and things would be further away because you don't have to do as much with them. And then eventually, it becomes wilderness where you don't do anything at all. And they talk about the need in permaculture. They're not thinking in terms of spirits at all. But they talk about the need for, they call them sort of corridors, and that link all of the different zones together. So you can think about it just in terms of wildlife. You need to have hedgehogs and things in your garden. They're wild animals. They live out in the wild, but it's good to have them coming in because they do beneficial things in the garden. So you need to have a connection between the wild places and the domestic places. And, again, it's a purely material kind of way of thinking about things in permaculture, pretty much. But at the same time, we can think about these zones. The wilderness zone at the bottom of the garden is the kind of, it's that place where things come in, and it's important to encourage them to a certain extent. If your garden doesn't have any of that in it. And this is why I've been thinking a lot about the importance of sort of signposting in gardens. And people do it practically anyway, like in fairy gardens and things like that. Or, they put sculptures in certain parts of the garden which embody a sense of that place. But, these kind of markers that we put into landscapes and gardens to remind us that they are inhabited places. Yeah, so there's and garden gnomes, obviously.
And statues of Pan, and statues of Venus, or whatever it is that I've got a great statue of I don't usually, unless they're the vintage ones, which I really like, I don't kind of tend to like the modern ones, but I found a really nice gnome. But yeah, I think about that a lot. In fact, funnily enough, and I hadn't heard about that experience with your children, and it's really enchanting, actually, and very interesting. But I had something similar happen here, because we live on the edge of a city. We've got quite a big garden, actually, because it's an old council estate, and we just happen to have a fairly big garden. And one day our little one was out in the paddling pool, and I'd put a slide to go into the paddling pool. So I can imagine the scene a bit like with your children jumping on the trampoline, and the raucous laughter and the joy, and that that adrenaline, and the pure joy of children having fun. This was what our little one was doing. She was going down the slide, out the paddling pool, up the slide, and just kept splashing into the pool with lots of joy. And she just kept doing this circuit, which again I think is interesting. And then suddenly at one point she looked up. She just stopped. She was about 2.5 or three, around 3 at the time. She stopped and looked beyond into a wild bit of the garden that had wild grasses that we actually removed a couple of weeks before then. And she just stopped still and stared at this spot, and I couldn't see what she was looking at. And then after however many seconds of standing there, just completely transfixed, she then carried on. And I said, what can you see? And she said, there's a monster over there. So to her, it wasn't, she didn't say a fairy or a gnome or anything like that. She's only so little. To her, it was a monster, and that's what it looked like to her. And I said, what does he look like? She said, he's got a black tummy. Now, there's nothing in our garden that would, I did get a gnome statue, but that wasn't until a couple of years later after this incident. But, it did make me think, because we had taken up the grasses there. And the other thing that had happened was that I'd done an interview with a woman that made fairy doors, and I bought one from her, and I put one just at the Wendy house, which is just in front of where she was looking. And it made me think about, whether that door is the threshold. Of course, that's another thing that we might put in our gardens. They're thresholds. I've talked
Yeah.
about this before, but I find it very interesting that we've got them everywhere in forests and inviting
Yeah.
the other world in. So
It's I just think it's so amazing. We don't think about, these sorts of mass-produced fairy doors, as being portals. But there's a cool thing. I remember when I was at university and I did some Egyptology classes, and they were talking about they call them, they're like false doors, I think they're called, in temples and sort of mortuary shrines and things like that, where carved door, and sometimes they even have that outstretched it's coming through the door, carved out coming through. But these were they were thought to be actual portals, even though it's a fake door. Offerings would be, left for the ancestors, the spirit of the person. And it's such an old idea that these fake doors, false doors, can actually be kind of spiritual doors. I do think there's something interesting in that.
sure. Yeah. Well, this is why I guess it's important if we do have, statues or fairy doors and we want to kind of invite, and you do need to be mindful about it, of course, but if you do want to invite communion with otherworld, then, offerings are suggested to whatever it is that you feel is of value to you, if you've made a nice cake or whatever, but whatever you want to offer. And there are cultural examples of that depending on kind of which way you want to go. But that, very much ties into it as well. And well, yeah, I know you're going to need to go shortly. And I will too. But it would be great to chat again because there's so much more to talk about in this. And I think, in Deep Weird, I really enjoyed, some chapters on near-death experiences. There was David Luke's experience with the DMT, which I've been reading up a lot about that actually, and the kind of tricksters and jesters and clowns that tend to appear in those sorts of experiences as well. So it'd be great to have you back sometime soon as a sort of second part to talk about those kinds of adventures with the other world that it'd be great to get into. But thank you very much for your time today, and thanks also for discussing about this idea of the end of the garden, because I think it's if people don't have their own gardens, it's something that they can find even within a park, that they can go to their local park and go to the parts that maybe people don't tend to bother with. So the old overgrown parts, these are great places, if it's safe, to go and meditate or just, commune with the trees if you're that way inclined, which is always a great idea. But yeah, to find the kind of more wild parts if you're living in a city and you don't have access to gardens. But,
and also those sort of verges. Verges are, again, these liminal areas. You might see dandelions down an alleyway. Yeah.
Exactly. Lovely. Great stuff. Well, yeah, thanks, Jack. And have you got any more online courses going to happen this year that people can jump into?
Yes. I'm doing a course in July. Can't remember the exact dates off the top of my head. With the Centre for Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred on imaginal ecologies. And it's about fairies, the other than human, and spirits. So that might be of interest.
That is
it's going to be kind of like, yeah, yeah, a survey of that kind of thing. And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, don't want to go too far into it now, but is this kind of idea of an expanded naturalism and an expanded view of the varieties and forms that mind and consciousness might take. So with this course, I'm trying to put all of these, strange beings and things almost onto a kind of a sliding scale of consciousness and life, really, that goes all the way from physical microorganisms all the way up to, I don't know, what could be at the very end of the spectrum, gods or things. So anyway, it's going to be fun.
The Azrael
Yeah.
that David Luke talks about, maybe he, if he's a he.
Yeah, a many-eyed threshold guardian.
Exactly. You will go no further. Brilliant. Okay, well, that's really exciting. So I'll get the links up for that too.
Yeah.
And we shall speak soon. And good luck with all the things that you've got going on. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening and watching. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider joining us on Patreon for dozens more episodes of unreleased bonus content, monthly online events, and a private chat. We are a warm, supportive community, and it really helps to support the project. Find us on patreon.com/the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast.